So this is going to be in many different parts, but I'm going to go into a chapter that's quite interesting in Bohm, and that's the proprioception of thought. And that to really understand thinking processes, you need to have a firm grip of what is proprioception. And proprioception, according to Bohm, is the unfoldment of the hollow movement. And David Bohm puts this as quite strongly. He says that practically all problems of the human race are due to the fact that thought is not proprioceptive. The fact you can get evidence that thought and feelings move as processes on their own. They're not being run by a me. They're not being produced by the me, and they are not being experienced by me. There is, however, some reference built into the whole system, and there is what is called proprioception, self-perception. Physically, a person is aware immediately that he has moved a part of his body. If some outside force suddenly moved your arm, you could tell that it is different from having moved it yourself. The nerves are built so as to be able to know that. So there is proprioception in the body. The distinction between actions which originates in the body and those which originate outside is perceived as a function of difference. In this light, the notion that there is a self as a kind of center in the body, as a center of activity, is natural. Animals have it too, obviously, and of course they are able to do that distinction. We can therefore say that this notion of I cannot be entirely wrong, or it probably would never have arisen. The question is, how does this natural useful distinction turn into the contradictions of the ego? Something that was correct and useful has somewhat developed in a way that has gone haywire. Thought lacks proprioception, and we have to learn somehow to observe thought. In the case of observing the body, you can tell that observation is somehow taking place, even when there is no sense of a distinct observer. Is it possible for thought, similar to observe itself, to see what it's doing, perhaps by awakening some other sense of what thought is, possibly through attention? In that way, thought may become proprioceptive. It would be self-aware. And I think what it's hinted at here is that the same attention we have towards the body, that could also be developed when it comes to thinking processes. You can be aware of thinking processes, and there is a movement going on there. I mentioned before that underlying the whole thing, whether it's unfolding or unfolding, there is a movement, and that goes for thinking processes. Thinking processes are implicit and explicit, and in between that explicitness and implicitness there is a movement, and this movement has the ability to self-observe. It's something that can be learned, and use the model of the body to do that. And this special mode is called self-perception. Self-perception has been common. We know that for a fact. We have many observations, written things, that people have been able to observe their own thoughts. this has become rarer and rarer, and there is probably a majority today that are not even aware that they have thinking processes and how they change and the direction of those. They are just going outwards, so just reacting to the world. If they get the stimuli, they simply react directly. And self-awareness or proprioception, the development of a higher ego could actually be controlling mechanism that would sort of heighten the senses when it comes to thinking, so you can be able to regulate your own thinking instead of just accepting the thinking processes as they are. You can direct them, better them, develop them, and I think this is part and parcel what used to be education. It's like heightening of the awareness, becoming more eloquent, becoming more refined. For instance, a woodcutter who's very good with doing things will become better and better as time passes because he regularly trains it. Whereas in our educational system, you don't change the hollow movement in yourself, so to speak. Only thing is you add constantly more objects of thinking and you pile those things up. But what happens in the end, you don't develop, you just have a heap of objects going around in your mind. And that's a little bit what I'm perceiving for the moment when it comes to myself. I have all these objects, knowledge objects heaped up, and somehow with the idea of implicit and explicit, these things starts to move about. There's a sensible, perceptible movement starting, slowly, but it is starting, and it's quite interesting because there has always been a movement, but it hasn't been that strong as it is now. And just being aware of the hollow movement is making the hollow movement be stronger. So I think we need to look over what is thinking, why this separation between thinking, memory and cognition. That didn't used to be the case, and this fantasy that memory could be something passive, I think that's completely ludicrous. I even heard some people said, we take this medicine and your memory is going to be better. What? The memory can only be better if you train it. You can take a medicine and all of a sudden you learn gardening. It's the same sort of thing. Jokingly, I heard somebody say, well, I want to learn French. Maybe I can put in a chip in my head and I directly understand French. That's similar. We think knowledge is localized somewhere, and therefore we don't think rote learning is of value. A little bit like they would develop an idea that physical training is completely useless because we already have bodies and muscles that need not to be trained. The idea of localized knowledge, that there's a specific part of my head where the knowledge of some particular thing is stored and I don't have to do anything about that, and the whole brain is just passively receiving the world. Those ideas are incredibly detrimental in education, and they cause great harm to poor students. And I think this is part and parcel of what created this incredible gap we see now in between Europe and the Western countries. Okay.